Driven by a chilling obsession to kill 6 women for the devil, the mind of the murderer behind the tragic deaths of 2 London sisters reveals a dark and twisted reality that no one saw coming. On the night of June 6, 2020, a quiet, serene park in London became the scene of a crime so brutal, it would leave the city, and the entire country, shocked. The late evening had started like any other, with Bibaa Henry, a 46-year-old woman, and her 27-year-old sister Nicole Smallman, out enjoying the warm summer air. The 2 sisters were celebrating Nicole's birthday, a moment meant for joy and laughter, but it would end in a tragedy that would haunt the nation forever. The sisters had arrived at Friend Country Park in northwest London around 9:30 p.m., ready to spend the evening together in what was supposed to be a peaceful, low-key celebration. They'd brought with them balloons, snacks, and music to mark the occasion. Their plan was simple: they'd enjoy the evening, hang out in nature, and have a little fun. But as the night wore on, the festive atmosphere took a dark turn. Something, or someone, lurking in the shadows was about to change the course of their lives forever. As the hours passed, Bibaa and Nicole remained unaware that they were being watched. Unbeknownst to them, a predator had been stalking the park, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The sisters were completely alone in the park at the time, a fact that the killer would later exploit to execute his violent plan. Around midnight, the unthinkable happened. The 2 women, who had been laughing and chatting just moments before, suddenly found themselves faced with a horrifying and unexpected threat. It wasn't long before the killer, Daniel Hussein, 18, appeared in the darkened park. Hussein had been lurking in the area, waiting for the right opportunity to attack. What followed was a brutal, unprovoked attack. In a fit of rage and malice, Hussein lunged at the sisters with a knife, slashing and stabbing them both. The horror of that moment is difficult to imagine, as the sisters fought desperately for their lives. But, despite their efforts, neither of them would survive the savage assault. After carrying out the murders, Hussein didn't immediately flee the scene. Instead, he spent time photographing the bodies, a chilling act that suggested his complete lack of remorse. These photographs, found on his phone later, revealed not only the extent of the violence but also Hussein's sickening satisfaction with his actions. He had committed a murder so brutal that even the most seasoned investigators were left stunned by its ferocity. As the night passed, no one knew the true horror that had unfolded in the park. It wasn't until the following morning that the tragedy would be discovered. Nicole's friends and family became alarmed when she hadn't returned home and couldn't be reached by phone. Desperate, they began searching for her and soon made the painful decision to call the police. The search led them to Friend Country Park, where they would make the heartbreaking discovery of the 2 sisters' bodies. The police were immediately alerted and dispatched to the scene. As investigators arrived, they quickly realized the magnitude of what had transpired. The crime was unlike anything they had encountered in recent years. 2 women had been viciously attacked, and their bodies had been left in the park under the cover of night. It was a murder that seemed to come out of nowhere, with no clear motive and no obvious leads. In the days that followed, the investigation into the murders would uncover a shocking and twisted motive, one that was driven by a dangerous obsession and a pact with the devil. But on that morning, when the bodies were discovered, all that was clear was the brutal violence of the crime and the horrifying realization that the killer was still out there. Daniel Hussein's life was a tangled web of delusions, obsessions, and a growing fixation on violence. At the heart of his twisted worldview lay an ideology that drove him to commit one of the most shocking murders in recent British history. His descent into madness was not sudden, but rather a gradual progression fueled by deep-seated hatred, an unhealthy obsession with certain dark figures, and a belief in his own warped sense of destiny. Hussein, at 18 years old, was already a deeply troubled young man, but it wasn't always evident to those around him. He had been described as quiet and somewhat of a loner, but nothing seemed particularly unusual about his behavior in the eyes of those who knew him. He was a teenager struggling with issues of identity and belonging, common struggles for many young people, but Hussein's troubles ran much deeper than typical adolescent angst. As his social isolation grew, so did his increasingly dangerous views. Hussein began to immerse himself in dark corners of the internet, exploring extreme ideologies that were often rooted in hatred and violence. His obsession with misogyny, in particular, became more pronounced as he spent hours scrolling through forums and websites that glorified violence against women. This online exposure to harmful content created an echo chamber, where his own twisted ideas were reinforced and validated by like-minded individuals. One of the most disturbing aspects of Hussein's mind was his growing obsession with a supernatural figure, the devil. This was not a passing phase or a mere curiosity about the occult, it was an integral part of his delusional thinking. Hussein believed that he was meant to carry out brutal acts in order to please this dark figure, and it was through a self-made pact with the devil that he justified his actions. His twisted belief was that by committing 6 murders, he would earn a place in hell and, in turn, receive power and status from the very force that he had pledged his allegiance to. The pact he made with the devil was not a secret. Hussein documented it in a handwritten letter, one that would later be discovered by investigators. The letter contained chilling language, describing his desire to kill and offering his soul in exchange for favor from the devil. In his mind, the act of murder was a divine mission, not an evil crime. This belief, an unshakable conviction that he was carrying out a higher purpose, was the driving force behind his attack on Bibaa and Nicole. At the time of the murders, Hussein had no direct connection to the victims. They were complete strangers to him, nothing more than innocent women enjoying a peaceful evening together. But this didn't matter to Hussein. In his deluded mind, they represented a necessary step in fulfilling his demonic pact. The random selection of the victims was part of his twisted plan, a plan he believed was preordained. As his obsession with the devil grew, Hussein's behavior became more erratic. He started to isolate himself even further, engaging in less and less social interaction with the outside world. He withdrew into his own mind, consumed by his thoughts of violence and domination. In Hussein's warped view of reality, the world was a battleground, and he was destined to be an instrument of chaos. In the lead up to the murders, Hussein had been preparing for what he saw as his divine task. He had bought a knife, which he would later use in the attack, and spent weeks honing his plan. He meticulously calculated the steps he would take to carry out the murders, picking a secluded spot in the park where he believed his actions would go unnoticed. Hussein was determined to follow through with his pact, convinced that completing these killings would bring him power beyond his comprehension. But his obsession wasn't just about fulfilling his dark mission, it was also about proving to himself that he had the strength to carry it out. For Hussein, the murders were a way to assert control, to prove his dominance over those he saw as weak or inferior. The fact that he targeted women, a group he had developed a deep-seated hatred for, was a reflection of his growing resentment and his belief that they were somehow deserving of his violence. By the time he struck, Hussein had fully embraced his delusions, and there was no turning back. The murders of Bibaa and Nicole were not random acts of violence, they were, in his mind, carefully orchestrated steps in a larger, sinister plan. The killer's obsession with power, control, and appeasing the devil had taken root, and he was willing to stop at nothing to achieve it. As the hours passed on June 7, 2020, Bibaa Henry and Nicole Smallman's family became increasingly worried. Nicole, who had been out celebrating her birthday with her sister, hadn't returned home, and neither of them had answered their phones. This was completely out of character for the two women, who were close-knit and always kept in touch with their loved ones. With no word from the sisters, and the fear that something had gone terribly wrong, their family knew they needed to take action. Nicole's mother, Mina Smallman, was the first to voice the mounting concern. It wasn't just that they were late, it was the sudden and complete lack of communication that set off alarm bells. The family knew something was wrong, and they were determined to find answers. Desperate to locate their loved ones, they began calling hospitals and local police stations, hoping for a glimpse of good news, but none came. As hours turned into a full day without any word, the family's worry transformed into a sense of dread. The once peaceful and carefree evening the two sisters had enjoyed was now clouded by an eerie silence. Their phones were dead, their whereabouts unknown, and no one could offer any explanations. The absence of any clues left the family in limbo, unsure of where to turn or what had happened to Bibaa and Nicole. On the morning of June 8, 2020, the search intensified. Nicole's friends, along with other family members, began combing the area around Friant Country Park. They knew that Nicole and Bibaa had spent the night there, and it made sense to start the search where they had last been. It was a gut-wrenching process, one filled with a mixture of hope and fear, but as the hours passed, there was still no sign of them. The family members grew increasingly frustrated, but their resolve to find answers never wavered. Then, at around 6 p.m., the unimaginable happened. The body of Nicole Smallman was discovered by a group of friends who had joined the search party. They had been scouring the park, walking through the dense underbrush, when they made a discovery that would forever change their lives. Nicole's lifeless body was found hidden in a secluded area, partially covered in branches and leaves, as if someone had tried to conceal it. The family had not yet been notified of the discovery of Nicole's body, and it was not until later that day that they would learn the devastating truth: both sisters were dead. It wasn't just Nicole that was found that evening. As the police arrived and began their investigation, Bibaa Henry's body was also discovered nearby, hidden in the same remote part of the park. The killer had left them there, cold and lifeless, with no regard for the devastation they had caused. The emotional toll on the family was indescribable. Mina Smallman, Nicole's mother, was overwhelmed with grief and disbelief. She had lost both of her daughters in the most violent and senseless way imaginable. The search for her daughter had come to a tragic, heartbreaking end, and the hope that they might have simply been lost had been shattered in an instant. The police immediately launched a full-scale investigation, but at first, there were few clues to follow. The crime scene was chilling, but it didn't provide immediate answers. The victims had been viciously attacked, but their bodies were carefully hidden, leaving behind a chilling trail of evidence that was not easily deciphered. No one had witnessed the attack, and no one knew why the sisters had been targeted. To the investigators, it was a complete mystery. It was in those first few days of the investigation that a deep sense of unease began to grow. This wasn't just any double murder. Something about the crime felt different. There was a cold, calculated nature to the attack. The killer had not simply killed for the sake of violence. There was a reason. But what was it? And who was the monster behind this brutal act? The family, meanwhile, could only wait in anguish. They knew the police were doing everything they could, but in the pit of their stomachs, they feared the worst. The truth seemed more elusive by the day, and all they could do was hope that the investigators would uncover the dark secrets hidden behind their daughters' deaths. In the wake of the brutal murders of Bibaa Henry and Nicole Smallman, the police launched a thorough and intensive investigation, determined to uncover the truth behind their deaths. The discovery of their bodies in Friant Country Park marked the beginning of a painstaking process of collecting evidence, speaking to witnesses, and trying to piece together a series of events that led to one of the most shocking double murders in recent memory. The scene itself was chilling. The bodies of the two women had been carefully concealed in a secluded corner of the park, hidden beneath branches and foliage, as if the killer wanted to ensure that their discovery would be delayed as long as possible. But despite the effort to cover up the crime, the evidence at the scene would prove invaluable in the coming investigation. Investigators quickly learned that Bibaa and Nicole had been brutally attacked. Both women had suffered multiple stab wounds, and the savagery of the attack suggested that their killer had acted with intense malice. There was no sign of struggle in the park that would suggest the attack had been a crime of passion or impulse. Instead, it appeared that the murders were premeditated and carried out with a chilling, calculated precision. The fact that the bodies were left in a secluded area, partially hidden, also suggested that the killer had carefully planned the disposal of their victims. One of the first major breakthroughs in the investigation came from the discovery of a witness, a crucial piece of the puzzle. It was reported that a man had been seen in the park on the night of the murders, acting suspiciously. This witness, whose sighting was initially dismissed as irrelevant, later proved to be pivotal. He described seeing a man in the park late that night who appeared to be walking alone and who looked out of place in the otherwise quiet, empty park. He recalled that the man had been carrying a large bag, which seemed to be heavy, and had a strange, unsettling presence. The man appeared to be agitated, and his movement suggested that he was either trying to hide something or trying to avoid being seen. As the investigation progressed, more details began to emerge. Forensic experts found traces of blood at the scene, which would later be linked to the killer. DNA evidence began to play a key role in narrowing down the list of suspects. It didn't take long for the police to begin focusing their attention on one particular person, Daniel Hussein. At first glance, Hussein appeared to be an unassuming young man, but the more investigators dug into his background, the more they uncovered a pattern of disturbing behavior. Hussein had been known to the police for minor incidents in the past, but nothing that would suggest he was capable of such a heinous crime. However, as detectives looked deeper into his activities, they began to see a darker side to his personality, a side that was increasingly consumed with hatred and violence. One of the first significant revelations about Hussein was his obsession with dark, occult practices. It was discovered that he had been involved in online communities that glorified violence and promoted extremist views, particularly those centered on misogyny and the hatred of women. These disturbing online activities were not just idle musings. Hussein's obsession with violence had clearly taken root, and his thoughts had grown more extreme and dangerous. But the most shocking piece of evidence was the letter that Hussein had written to the devil. In this twisted document, Hussein described his desire to carry out a series of murders in exchange for power and favor from the devil himself. He believed that by committing 6 murders, he would earn a place in hell and be granted supernatural strength and status. This letter, which Hussein had kept hidden, would become a key piece of evidence that would help authorities understand his warped motives. As the investigation into Hussein deepened, it became clear that his attack on Bibaa and Nicole had been no random act of violence. These women, unknown to him before that night, were selected solely to fulfill the twisted pact he had made. They were victims of a mind consumed by delusions of power, and they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. With the evidence stacking up against him, Hussein's story began to unravel. He was arrested shortly after the bodies were discovered, and as the investigation continued, detectives worked tirelessly to connect all the dots. They uncovered a growing trail of disturbing behaviors that led them to the conclusion that Hussein was not only the perpetrator of the murders, but was also driven by an unshakable belief that he was carrying out a higher purpose, one that would forever change the lives of those affected by his actions. On July 1, 2020, just weeks after the brutal murders of Bibaa Henry and Nicole Smallman, the police finally closed in on Daniel Hussein. Their suspicions, fueled by forensic evidence and his unsettling online history, led them to arrest him at his home in Blackheath, southeast London. What followed was a chilling series of events that would shock the world, as Hussein's confession revealed the true depths of his delusions and the extent of the horror he had inflicted upon 2 innocent women. Hussein's arrest was part of a coordinated effort between detectives from the Metropolitan Police and the local authorities, who had been working tirelessly to gather evidence and piece together the puzzle of the murders. The investigation had already linked Hussein's DNA to the crime scene, and his movements had been traced to the area surrounding Fry End Country Park on the night of the killings. All of this evidence pointed squarely to him as the killer, but it was the confession that truly revealed the terrifying extent of his motives. When Hussein was brought in for questioning, the police initially hoped to confront him with the evidence they had gathered. But Hussein, whose demeanor had been described as cold and detached, offered no resistance. Instead, he sat in the interview room, his face unreadable, as the detectives laid out the evidence they had against him. It was only a matter of time before he would crack under the pressure. Hussein's response to the police was chilling in its casualness. He admitted to the murders, but what made his confession so unsettling was the complete lack of remorse or guilt. To him, the killings were not crimes, they were part of a divine mission he had chosen to undertake. Hussein explained that he had made a pact with the devil, a pact that required him to kill 6 women in exchange for power and favor in the afterlife. He was unshaken, almost matter-of-fact in his recounting of the events that had led to the deaths of Bibaa and Nicole. The confession revealed details that sent shivers down the spine of investigators. Hussein had stalked the park on the night of the murders, watching Bibaa and Nicole from a distance before finally closing in on them. He had no personal connection to the victims, no motive other than his warped belief that they were simply obstacles in the fulfillment of his dark pact. The violence he inflicted on them was brutal and calculated, a reflection of his complete detachment from the human suffering he caused. In his mind, their deaths were a necessary part of the path he had chosen. As the interview continued, Hussein revealed more about his twisted worldview. He spoke about the letters he had written to the devil, the promises he had made, and his belief that committing these murders would grant him power beyond his comprehension. His mind had been consumed by these delusions, and he truly believed that by carrying out these heinous acts, he was fulfilling a higher purpose. The fact that his victims were women only seemed to fuel his delusion further. He viewed them as weak and deserving of his violence. What made Hussein's confession even more terrifying was his lack of emotion. Throughout the entire interview, he remained eerily calm, as though he was recounting a routine event, not the brutal killings of two innocent women. There was no remorse, no hint of guilt, just the cold, unwavering certainty that he had done nothing wrong. In his eyes, his actions had been justified. He believed that he was serving a greater cause, and that was all that mattered to him. As the confession came to an end, Hussein was formally charged with the murders of Bibaa Henry and Nicole Smallman. The arrest was a significant moment in the investigation, but for the family of the victims, it was only the beginning of a long and painful process. The arrest had brought some measure of justice, but it did little to ease the overwhelming grief that they were left to cope with. The chilling nature of Hussein's confession, coupled with his complete lack of empathy, left an indelible mark on everyone involved in the case. It was hard to comprehend how someone so young could become so consumed by such dark, violent beliefs. For Bibaa and Nicole's family, the arrest did little to fill the gaping hole left by the loss of their loved ones, but it did offer a small sense of closure as they moved towards seeking justice for the horrific crimes that had been committed against them. As Daniel Hussein stood in the dock at the Old Bailey, the weight of the crime he had committed against Bibaa Henry and Nicole Smallman became all the more real. His chilling confession had already confirmed his guilt, but the trial would expose the full extent of his disturbing motivations, revealing just how deeply his mind had been consumed by delusions. For the families of the two sisters, the trial was an agonizing process, one that forced them to relive the horrors of the murders all over again. But it was also an opportunity for justice to be served. The trial began in September 2021, and from the outset, the prosecution outlined the evidence that linked Hussein to the murders. DNA evidence, witness testimony, and his own confession painted a clear and undeniable picture. The defense, however, attempted to argue that Hussein was not fully responsible for his actions, citing his mental state and suggesting that he was suffering from a psychosis. This argument was based on Hussein's claims that he had been driven by a need to fulfill a pact with the devil and that his actions were part of a larger spiritual mission. But the prosecution, backed by the evidence of Hussein's methodical planning and the brutality of the murders, strongly disagreed with the defense's attempt to mitigate his responsibility. They argued that Hussein's actions were not those of a man driven by psychosis, but rather of a man who had carefully planned and executed the murders in a deliberate, cold-blooded manner. His obsession with violence and the occult was a clear indication of his dangerous mindset, and the prosecution argued that he was fully aware of what he was doing when he murdered the two women. Throughout the trial, the heartbreaking testimonies of Bibaa and Nicole's family members painted a devastating picture of the emotional toll the murders had taken on them. Mina Smallman, the mother of Nicole, spoke tearfully about the loss of her daughters and the emptiness that had consumed her life since that fateful night in June 2020. She described the bond that her daughters had shared, a bond that had been tragically severed by a man whose obsession with violence had led to their deaths. Her words struck at the heart of the case, as the jury came to understand just how deeply these murders had affected the family, leaving them to grapple with a grief that would never truly go away. Grapple with a grief that would never truly go away. The trial also shed light on the horrifying details of the murders themselves. It was revealed that Hussein had stalked Bibaa and Nicole for hours before attacking them, silently watching them as they celebrated Nicole's birthday in the park. When the two women were alone, Hussein struck. He ambushed them, inflicting a savage attack that would end their lives in an instant. The brutality of the killings was compounded by the fact that Hussein had left their bodies to be found in a secluded part of the park, hidden beneath branches and foliage, as if he was attempting to erase any trace of the crime. One of the most haunting aspects of the trial was the revelation that Hussein had been planning to kill 6 women as part of his twisted pact with the devil. Bibaa and Nicole were not chosen because of any personal vendetta, but because they were simply victims of a delusional mind. Their deaths were part of Hussein's broader, dark belief that killing women would somehow grant him power and favor in the afterlife. The thought that two innocent women had been chosen at random to satisfy a deranged fantasy was almost too much for their families to bear. As the trial came to an end, the jury deliberated on Hussein's fate. Despite the defense's arguments of mental illness, the evidence against Hussein was overwhelming, and in November 2021, he was found guilty of the murders of Bibaa Henry and Nicole Smallman. The judge, Lord Justice Haddon Cave, sentenced Hussein to life imprisonment with a minimum of 35 years before being considered for parole. The conviction brought a sense of justice to the family, but it did little to ease the pain they had endured since that tragic night. For Mina Smallman and the rest of Bibaa and Nicole's family, the trial was a devastating chapter in an ongoing tragedy. The loss of two vibrant young women who had their whole lives ahead of them was a wound that would never fully heal. But as the court proceedings came to a close, there was some measure of closure. The man who had taken their daughters' lives would now spend the rest of his life behind bars, unable to inflict any more harm. However, for the family, the road to healing was just beginning, and the memory of Bibaa and Nicole would remain etched in their hearts forever. The conviction of Daniel Hussein brought some sense of closure to the case, but for the families of Bibaa Henry and Nicole Smallman, the grief of their loss was far from over. The murder of two beloved sisters, two vibrant, young women, had left a void that could never be filled. No amount of justice could bring them back, and no punishment could undo the pain of their untimely deaths. What was left for their family was a profound and enduring sorrow, a grief that would be carried with them for the rest of their lives. Mina Smallman, the mother of Nicole, had become the voice of the family throughout the trial and the months following the murders. In interviews, social media posts, and public appearances, she expressed the agony she felt losing not one, but two of her children. The bond between a mother and her daughters is unbreakable, and the pain of having that bond torn apart was unbearable. In her interviews, Mina described the profound emptiness she felt, as though a part of her had been ripped away. It wasn't just the loss of her daughters, it was the loss of their futures, the futures that they would never have the chance to fulfill. The grief was not just emotional but physical. Mina spoke of the sleepless nights, the relentless thoughts of what might have been, and the overwhelming desire to have one last conversation with her daughters. It was clear that the trauma of the murders would affect her for the rest of her life, as she was left to cope with a hole in her heart that would never heal. The Smallman family had been irrevocably changed, and the impact of that change would ripple through every aspect of their lives. Bibaa Henry's family, too, was left to grapple with the loss of a kind-hearted woman who had always put others first. Bibaa had been known for her loving and generous spirit, and her death left a deep wound in the lives of those who knew her. In the months following her passing, her family members struggled to come to terms with the senselessness of her murder. They spoke of her warmth, her laughter, and the way she brought joy into the lives of everyone around her. Losing Bibaa was a tragedy not just for her family, but for the community that had cherished her. In the wake of the murders, there was also an outpouring of support from the public. Many people expressed their condolences and offered comfort to the grieving families. The case had resonated deeply with people across the world, who were shocked by the brutality of the crime and the senselessness of Hussein's actions. Yet, while the public support was appreciated, it could never fill the void left by the loss of two lives. The reality of the situation was that no amount of sympathy could bring Bibaa and Nicole back. Their deaths had left an irreplaceable gap, and it was one that their families would carry forever. As time passed, the Smallman family began to shift their focus to honoring the memories of Bibaa and Nicole. The sisters had left behind a legacy that would not be forgotten. Nicole, an aspiring photographer, had dreams that had been cruelly snatched away, but her work lived on. Bibaa, who had worked in the care industry, was remembered for her selflessness and compassion. Both women had touched many lives, and their families sought to keep their legacies alive through charitable initiatives and acts of remembrance. The impact of Bibaa and Nicole's deaths rippled out beyond their families to the wider community. The murder of the two sisters highlighted the vulnerability of women, especially when it came to being targeted by individuals with violent and distorted worldviews. The case drew attention to the issue of violence against women and the ways in which society needed to work together to address these crimes. But for the Smallman family, the focus was never on the broader issue, it was always on the personal loss they had endured. No amount of time behind bars could undo the pain and grief that the sisters' deaths had caused. The justice system had held Hussein accountable, but for the family, it was cold comfort in the face of their profound sorrow. The sentencing of Hussein marked the end of the legal battle, but it did little to ease the heartache that lingered in the wake of the murders. The Smallman and Henry families would forever be left with the absence of two beloved women, two sisters whose lives had been taken in an act of incomprehensible violence. The legal process, while bringing justice, also served as a painful reminder of the brutal reality of their loss. In the months following the trial, the families of Bibaa and Nicole continued to raise awareness about the impact of violence against women. While the legal proceedings were concluded, the emotional and psychological toll of the murders remained. The pursuit of justice had been hard won, but it would never fully undo the damage that Hussein's actions had inflicted on so many lives. The tragic murders of Bibaa Henry and Nicole Smallman have left an indelible mark on the lives of those who knew them, and their story continues to resonate with the public. While the justice system has delivered its verdict, the lives of the two sisters are far more than just a case to be solved. They were real people, with dreams, love, and futures that were cruelly taken away. In remembering Bibaa and Nicole, it's essential to honor their lives, not just as victims of a brutal crime, but as two remarkable women whose legacies continue to impact those around them. Bibaa Henry, at 46 years old, was a kind-hearted and vibrant woman. She was a beloved mother, a sister, and a friend. Bibaa had a passion for dancing and was known for her love of life. She was someone who brought joy to those around her, lighting up every room she entered. Her spirit and positivity were infectious, and she was known for her big heart and deep empathy for others. Bibaa had a family who adored her and friends who cherished her company. Her tragic death left a void that can never be filled. Nicole Smallman, just 27 years old, was a young woman full of promise and ambition. Nicole was known for her outgoing personality, her sense of humor, and her infectious laughter. She was a talented photographer with an eye for capturing beautiful moments, and her work was a reflection of her creative soul. Nicole was a strong and independent woman who loved fiercely and cared deeply for those she held close. Her career was just beginning to take shape, and she had big dreams for the future. Nicole's loss was not just felt by her family, but by everyone who knew her. Together, Bibaa and Nicole were inseparable. As sisters, they shared a deep bond that was rooted in love and mutual respect. Their relationship was one of laughter, shared experiences, and unbreakable support. The two women spent their time together, enjoying life and creating memories. It was a beautiful sisterhood that was tragically interrupted by a random act of violence. They were in the prime of their lives when Hussein took everything from them in an unimaginable act of cruelty. The impact of their deaths reverberated through their family and friends. Bibaa and Nicole's mother, who had raised them with love and care, was devastated by the loss of her daughters. The grief was unbearable, and it became a public outpouring of sorrow and loss. Their family was left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by violence. They were forced to navigate the difficult journey of mourning while also advocating for justice. Despite the unimaginable pain, the family of Bibaa and Nicole did not let their tragic deaths define the memory of their lives. Instead, they worked tirelessly to keep the memory of the sisters alive in a positive way, raising awareness of the violence that led to their deaths and advocating for change. Bibaa and Nicole's story became a rallying cry for many, a testament to the senselessness of violence and the need for greater protection for women in society. In the wake of the murders, the family of Bibaa and Nicole launched campaigns to support women's safety and to shine a light on the dangers that many women face every day. They used their voices to demand change and to ensure that their loved ones' deaths were not in vain. Bibaa and Nicole's legacy became a symbol of strength and resilience, as their family and supporters continued to fight for justice and for the protection of others from similar violence. The tragedy of Bibaa and Nicole's deaths is a stark reminder of the fragility of life, and the way in which a single act of violence can shatter countless lives. It serves as a call to action for all of us to look out for one another, to raise awareness of the dangers women face, and to ensure that no one else has to endure the pain of losing a loved one in such a senseless and violent way. While Bibaa and Nicole may no longer be with us, their legacy lives on. They are remembered for their love, their laughter, and the joy they brought to the lives of everyone around them. In their memory, their family continues to raise their voices and advocate for change. The lives of these two sisters will never be forgotten, and their legacy will continue to inspire others to work toward a safer world for women everywhere. And there you have it, the haunting story of Bibaa Henry and Nicole Smallman, two sisters whose lives were tragically cut short. Their story is a reminder of the darkness that can exist in the world, but also of the incredible strength and resilience of their family. While the fight for justice has brought some closure, their legacy is far from over. If you found this story compelling, and you want to hear more true crime tales like this one, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps keep these stories alive and pushes for justice to be heard. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more gripping true crime documentaries. Until next time, stay safe, and keep seeking the truth.